Table 9 had 4 guests, wine already poured, laughter already loud. I leaned down and asked all of them to leave, calmly, once. They thought it was a joke. My manager did not. She pulled me aside within seconds, her voice already sharp enough to cut through the noise of the room. I told her I needed those 4 people out of my section, now, not later. Seconds after that, every single person in that restaurant understood exactly why I said it. I am going to tell you the same thing, but slower. This channel exists for people who trust what they see, even when nobody else does yet. If that is you, subscribing genuinely helps more than you would think. All right, here is how that night actually started. My name is Marisol, though everyone at the restaurant just called me Mari, and the place was called Thistlewood, a mid-range dining room on the corner of a street that used to be quiet before 3 new apartment buildings went up around it. Thistlewood had that particular kind of charm that older restaurants get once they stop trying to be trendy: dark wood paneling, brass fixtures that the owner refused to modernize, and a small private alcove near the back that everyone on staff called the Nook, even though officially it was Table 9. Table 9 was not like the other tables. It sat behind a half wall, closer to the kitchen than the dining room proper, and it had its own small decorative fireplace insert that the previous owner had installed maybe 15 years earlier, back when gas fireplaces in restaurants were considered a charming novelty rather than a liability. It had been retrofitted twice since then. It worked. It looked nice. Nobody thought about it beyond that. The manager on shift that night was a woman named Deborah Ashcombe, though staff called her Debbie only behind her back and Ms. Ashcombe to her face, out of something between respect and mild fear. Debbie had been running restaurant floors for close to 20 years by that point. She was not the kind of manager who yelled, and she was not the kind of manager who dismissed her staff. She listened. She just also happened to run a tight floor, because loose floors lose money, and sometimes lose more than that, and she had learned that the hard way at some point before I ever met her. I want to be clear about Debbie from the very beginning, because what happened that night was never about her being wrong to doubt me. She had every reason to. I had been at Thistlewood barely long enough to learn the wine list, and I was asking her to pull 4 paying, well-behaved guests out of a full dining room on a Friday night, based on nothing I could actually point to. The 4 guests came in around 7 in the evening. 2 couples, or so it appeared. A man who introduced himself to the host as celebrating his wife of 11 years, a second couple who he said were old friends joining them, and a reservation under the name Whitmore. On paper, nothing about it stood out. People celebrate anniversaries at Thistlewood constantly. We had a whole laminated card behind the host stand with suggestions for how to surprise a partner with a dessert candle, a card the owner was very proud of. The first thing I noticed, and I want to be honest that at the time I did not notice it as a thing worth noticing, was that the woman being celebrated did not reach for her own wine glass. Her husband poured for her, refilled for her, and at one point moved her glass 2 inches to the left without being asked, the way you move something for a child or for someone who cannot quite reach it themselves. I filed it away the way you file away anything slightly odd in a restaurant, which is to say, I did not file it away at all. I had 6 other tables. The second thing happened about 20 minutes later, when I came to check on their appetizers. The woman thanked me by name, using the name on my tag, which was normal, except she said it very carefully, the way you say a word in a language you do not speak fluently, sounding it out rather than saying it. And when I asked how everything tasted, she looked toward her husband before she answered, just for half of a second, the kind of glance you would miss completely if you were not standing at the exact angle I happened to be standing at. By itself, that meant nothing. People check in with their partners constantly. Married for 11 years, sure. Maybe he ordered for her. Maybe that was just how they operated. I want to be fair to every possible normal explanation, because at the time, I was being fair to them. I did not walk into that dining room already suspicious. Nothing about table 9 screamed anything. It whispered, and only barely, and only if you happened to be listening at the exact moments it whispered. The third thing was the fireplace insert. I had walked past that alcove probably 400 times since I started at Thistlewood, close enough to that number that it might as well be exact, and I had never once thought about the flame color, because why would I? That night, passing by with a tray of bread, I noticed the flame in the insert had a thin blue edge to it, where it usually ran a clean, steady orange, the kind of orange that looks almost decorative, like a photograph of fire rather than fire itself. Blue was different. Blue was not something I had a reason to know anything about, except that my uncle, who did HVAC work for 20-some years, had once told me, half joking, that a stove flame turning blue and hissing quiet instead of humming meant somebody needed to call a technician before somebody else needed to call an ambulance. I had filed that away in the part of my brain where you keep things a family member told you once at a barbecue, which is to say, nowhere useful until suddenly it was exactly where I needed it. I did not put any of this together in one motion. I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story that sounds impressive is the version where I walked past that table once and instantly understood everything. And that version is not true. The truth is slower and messier and much more human. It took the better part of 40 minutes, 3 separate trips to that table, and one moment where I stood at the server station doing absolutely nothing useful except staring at nothing, running the pieces through my head like a hand of cards I could not make sense of. The husband was not drinking his own wine either. He had ordered a bottle, poured 4 glasses with what looked like real enthusiasm, made a toast, clinked glasses, the whole performance, and then his glass sat there the entire appetizer course, untouched, condensation gathering on the outside of it in a ring that told me it had been sitting exactly where it was for a long time. The friend across from him, the one introduced casually as an old college buddy, drank steadily and heavily, 3 glasses in the time it took the rest of the table to finish one course, and laughed a half-second too late after every joke, like a man watching a performance rather than participating in a conversation with friends of over a decade. And then there was the smell. This is the part I have gone back and forth on how to describe honestly, because smell is such an unreliable thing to build a story around. And I do not want to make this sound more dramatic than it was. It was faint. It was not the dramatic rotten egg smell people associate with gas leaks in movies, because that smell, the sulfur smell, gets added on purpose to natural gas specifically, so people notice it. And what I was catching was something underneath that, something metallic and slightly sweet, barely there beneath the smell of bread and candle wax and perfume. The kind of smell you only notice if you happen to lean down close enough at the exact right moment, for reasons that had nothing to do with the smell itself. I leaned down close because the woman being celebrated had put her head down on her folded arms for just a moment, the way you do when you are exhausted rather than sick, and I asked, quietly, if she was feeling all right, and she lifted her head and smiled at me with the kind of smile that takes real effort to hold in place, and said she was fine, just a long week, and thank you for asking. Her husband put a hand on her shoulder in a way that could have been tender and could have been something else entirely, and I could not, at that moment, have told you which one it actually was. I want to slow down here because I know exactly where this is going in your head, and I'm not going to pretend I had it all figured out yet either. What I had, at that point, standing near the server station with a half-full water pitcher sweating in my hand, was not an answer. It was a feeling built entirely out of small, ordinary things that individually meant nothing. A wife who did not pour her own wine, a husband who did not drink his, a friend laughing on a half-second delay, a blue flame where an orange one should have been, a smell that should not have been there at all. None of it, on its own, was anything. Put together, it sat in my chest like a held breath I did not know how to let out. I did what I probably should not have done, which was walk back to that fireplace insert on the pretense of adjusting a decorative log that did not need adjusting, and I put my hand near the vent along the top edge of the unit, the way you check if an oven is preheating, and the air coming off of it was warmer than it should have been for a decorative flame that size, warm in a way that felt less like ambiance and more like something working harder than it was supposed to. That was the moment I stopped bussing tables and started walking toward Debbie's office at the back of the restaurant, my hands not quite steady, running through in my head exactly how I was going to explain any of this to a woman with 20 years of experience running a floor, using nothing but a cold wine glass, a delayed laugh, and a smell I could not even name. I found her at the little desk behind the kitchen doing the nightly liquor count, and I said her name once before I lost my nerve entirely, and she looked up at me already sensing, the way experienced managers always seem to sense, that whatever I was about to say was going to cost her something before the night was through. I told Debbie I needed to speak with her about Table 9, and I watched her set down her clipboard slowly, the way you set down something when you already suspect the next few minutes are going to be difficult. She asked me what was wrong, and I remember standing there for a full 3 seconds without an answer, because the honest answer was that I did not entirely know. Not in a way I could turn into a sentence that would make sense to a woman who had run this floor for 20 years. I told her I thought something was wrong with the fireplace insert near Table 9. She asked me what, specifically, and I said the flame looked different, that it had gone from orange to a thin blue at the edges, and that the vent along the top was putting off more heat than usual. She asked if I had told maintenance. I said not yet, because I had come straight to her first, and she nodded slowly, already reaching for the radio clip to her belt, already doing exactly what a good manager does, which was take the concern seriously enough to act on the parts of it she could verify. That should have been the end of it. A radio call to maintenance, a technician walking over from wherever they were stationed in the building, a quiet inspection while the dining room carried on undisturbed. And it almost was the end of it, except that I kept talking, because the fireplace was not actually the thing sitting heaviest in my chest, and some part of me could not let it go without saying the rest. I told her about the woman not drinking her own wine. I told her about the husband not touching his glass all night, despite pouring it with such enthusiasm. I told her about the friend laughing late, about the tired smile, about the smell I could not name, but could not stop thinking about either. And I watched Debbie's face shift while I talked, not into annoyance, which is what I had braced myself for, but into something more careful, more measuring, the expression of someone trying to figure out how much weight to put on a stack of details that individually weighed almost nothing at all. She asked me directly whether I thought the guests were in some kind of danger, or whether I thought something else entirely was going on at that table, something between the 4 of them that had nothing to do with the restaurant. I want to be honest that I did not have a clean answer to that question, because both possibilities were sitting in my head at the same time, tangled together in a way I could not fully separate. Maybe the wife was unwell and hiding it out of pride. Maybe something domestic was happening at that table that was none of my business. Maybe none of it meant anything, and I was a new employee overreacting to a slow week of nerves. Or maybe And this was the thought I could not shake, no matter how hard I tried to talk myself out of it. Maybe the reason nobody at that table was drinking properly, and the reason the air near that alcove felt wrong, were connected in a way that had nothing to do with anybody's marriage, and everything to do with what was actually coming out of that fireplace vent. Debbie made the radio call to maintenance while I stood there, and she told them to check the gas line and the flame regulator on the insert near the back alcove as a priority. Not an emergency, just a priority, which was already more than most managers would have done off of a server description of flame color. She told me she appreciated me bringing it to her, and for one brief moment, I thought that would be the whole conversation, that I could go back to my other 6 tables and let the professionals handle the rest. Then I asked her if we could move table 9 to a different section while maintenance checked the unit, just as a precaution, and that is where the conversation changed. Debbie explained calmly and reasonably why that was not something she could simply do. It was Friday night. The dining room was fully booked. Moving a party of 4 mid-meal without a clear and confirmed reason was the kind of thing that generated complaints, generated bad reviews, generated exactly the sort of scene that made guests uncomfortable and made staff look incompetent. She said, and I remember this clearly because it was fair and I could not argue with it even as I hated hearing it, that a change in flame color could mean a dozen things, most of them minor: a clogged burner port, a slightly imbalanced gas mixture, a draft from the kitchen door pulling air through the vent at an angle that shifted the color temperature. She said maintenance would check it within 10 minutes, and if there was anything actually wrong, we would address it then, calmly, without alarming 4 guests who, as far as anyone else in that restaurant could tell, were having a lovely anniversary dinner. It made sense. I want anyone listening to this to understand that Debbie was not being dismissive, and she was not protecting the restaurant over the guests. She was doing exactly what 20 years of experience had taught her was the responsible thing to do with the information she actually had in front of her, which was a new server describing a slightly different flame color and a smell she could not identify. If I had been standing in her shoes, with her experience, with the same information, and none of what I was actually feeling, I probably would have made the same call. That is the part of this story I need you to sit with for a moment, because it matters for everything that happens after. She was not wrong to say no. She was reasonable. I was the one holding a piece of the picture she could not see, and I did not yet have the words to make her see it. I went back out onto the floor because there was nothing else to do, and I checked my other tables, poured waters, cleared plates, all while my eyes kept drifting back toward that half wall near the alcove, watching for a maintenance technician who had not yet appeared, watching the thin edge of blue flame that I could just barely make out from the server station if I angled myself exactly right. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The restaurant on a Friday night does not run on a clock that bends easily for anyone, and I understood later that the maintenance technician on shift that night had been pulled into an unrelated issue in the walk-in cooler, a compressor alarm that needed immediate attention because a full weekend of proteins was at stake. And so the priority call about a flame color near table 9 sat in a queue behind a problem that, on paper, looked more urgent. I did not know any of that at the time. All I knew was that 15 minutes had passed, and the wife at table 9 had put her head down on her arms a second time, longer this time, and her husband was rubbing slow circles on her back with an expression that had stopped looking like tenderness and had started looking like fear, the specific kind of fear you cannot fake convincingly, even if you tried. The friend across from them had gone quiet, no longer laughing on delay, just staring at his own hands on the table, like he was trying to remember how many fingers he was supposed to have. I went back to Debbie a second time. I did not wait to be asked what was wrong. I told her I did not think we had 10 more minutes, let alone the time it was actually taking, and I asked her again to let me move that table, or at minimum to open the kitchen door beside the alcove to get airflow moving through that section of the dining room. She told me maintenance was on their way, that she had already checked in, that the delay was the cooler compressor and nothing more, and she asked me, not unkindly, but firmly, to trust the process and get back to my station, because 4 other tables in my section had been waiting on drink refills for longer than they should have. I said something back to her in that moment that I am not proud of, not because it was cruel, but because it was the first time in my life I had ever spoken to someone in a position of authority over me with that particular tone, the tone of someone who has stopped being polite because politeness has stopped feeling like it matters as much as being heard. I told her that if she wanted to write me up for it afterward, that was fine, but that I was not going back to my station and that I was going to go tell those 4 people to leave that table, whether she authorized it or not. She looked at me the way you look at someone who has just said something that cannot be unsaid, and her expression was not anger exactly. It was closer to disbelief, the specific disbelief of a person who has run a floor for 20 years and has never once had a server threaten to override her judgment on the dining room in front of paying guests. She told me, in a voice that had gone very quiet and very even, the kind of quiet that is more frightening than yelling could ever be, that if I stepped onto that floor and disrupted a full table of guests without her authorization, I would not be finishing my shift that night, and we could discuss whether I would be finishing my employment at all once the dining room cleared out. She said it once. She did not raise her voice. And I want you to understand something before we go any further into this story, into the part where you find out whether I listened to her or not. And that is that Debbie Ashcombe was not being cruel in that moment. And she was not being unreasonable either. She was protecting a restaurant that was fully booked on a Friday night from a 19-year-old server who, as far as she could tell, was about to make a scene over a flame color and a smell nobody else in that building could detect. I stood there in that narrow hallway behind the kitchen with my heart hammering against my ribs in a rhythm I did not recognize as my own, staring at a woman who had every professional reason in the world to fire me on the spot, and I had maybe 10 seconds to decide whether 20 years of her experience outweighed 40 minutes of mine. I made my decision before I even finished deciding it, which sounds strange to say out loud, but that is the honest truth of how it happened. My body was already moving past Debbie before my mind had finished weighing her 20 years against my 40 minutes. I walked out of that hallway and back onto the floor, and I heard her call my name once behind me, sharp, the kind of sharp that was meant to stop me in my tracks, and it did not. I crossed the dining room faster than I should have for someone carrying nothing, weaving between 2 servers with trays lifted at shoulder height, past a table of 6 who were mid-laugh at something I would never know the punchline to, and I reached table 9 with my hands shaking in a way I could not hide and did not try to. I leaned down between the husband and the wife, and I kept my voice as calm and as quiet as I could make it, because the last thing I wanted was to turn this into a scene before I even understood what I was dealing with. I told them I needed everyone at the table to stand up and step outside with me, right now, calmly. No need to grab their things, just stand and walk toward the front door. The husband asked me if this was some kind of joke, and the wife, the one who had put her head down twice already, looked up at me with eyes that were glassy in a way I had not let myself fully register until that exact moment. and something in my chest went cold and certain all at once. I said it again, the same words, the same calm voice, because I did not have time to explain myself, and I knew that the moment I started explaining, I would lose whatever window I had left. I said, please, now, all four of you, and I reached out and put my hand on the back of the wife's chair, not touching her, just close enough to guide her upward if she needed guiding. That is when Debbie reached the table behind me, her voice already sharp enough to cut through the noise of the room, exactly the way I described at the very start of this. She said my name once, and I turned around and told her in front of all four guests that I needed those four people out of my section now, not later. I watched something pass over her face that I can only describe as the exact moment a person decides whether to escalate a situation or to trust against every professional instinct they have. The person standing in front of them, she did not escalate. I want to be clear that this was the moment everything could have gone differently, and it did not, because Debbie Ashcombe, for reasons I would not fully understand until much later, chose in that half second to stop being my manager and start being someone who noticed for the first time that the woman at that table could not keep her eyes open. The four of them stood, slowly, unsteadily, the wife needing her husband's arm more than anyone at that table wanted to admit out loud, and we walked them, all six of us really, toward the front doors of Thistlewood, past a dining room full of guests who had gone quiet in that particular way. A room goes quiet when it senses something real happening in front of it, something that is not part of the show. I want to pause here for a moment, because I know some of you watching this have been in a version of this exact position, standing in a hallway or an office or a hospital waiting room with a piece of information nobody else can see. And I would genuinely like to know, in the comments below, what the hardest part was for you. Not the moment you were finally believed, but the specific minute right before that, when you were still alone with what you knew. I read every single one of those comments, and that particular minute is the part of this story I think about the most. We got all four of them outside onto the sidewalk in front of the restaurant, into the cold night air, and within maybe 90 seconds of standing outside, the wife's breathing changed in a way that made my stomach drop even further than it already had. She started saying that she felt dizzy, that the sidewalk seemed to be tilting slightly beneath her, and her husband, the same man who had asked me 30 seconds earlier if this was some kind of joke, was now holding her up with both arms and asking her, panic climbing fast into his voice, if she was going to be sick. Debbie was already on the radio again, but this time, the words coming out of her mouth were entirely different from the calm priority request she had made 40 minutes earlier. She was telling the maintenance technician to shut off the gas line to that fireplace insert immediately, not check it, not inspect it, shut it off. And she was telling the host to open every door along the front of the restaurant and to start moving guests seated within 20 feet of that alcove toward the opposite side of the dining room, quietly, without alarming anyone, using exactly the kind of calm, practiced language that a 20-year floor manager keeps in her back pocket for moments she has trained for but hoped never to actually need. The old college friend, the one who had been laughing a half-second late all night, sat down hard on the curb outside, put his head between his knees, and said, to nobody in particular, that he had been feeling strange since maybe an hour into dinner, that he had chalked it up to the wine, that he almost never got headaches like that from wine. I stood there on that sidewalk with my arms wrapped around myself against the cold, watching four people who 30 minutes earlier had thought I was interrupting a perfectly nice anniversary dinner over nothing, now sitting or leaning against the brick wall of Thistlewood, breathing in gulps of cold, outside air, like it was the first real air any of them had breathed in hours. And some part of me finally let go of the breath I had apparently been holding since I first noticed the wife not reaching for her own wine glass. Debbie came and stood next to me while we waited, both of us watching the ambulance lights turn the corner 2 blocks down, throwing red and white across the brick front of the building in slow, rotating pulses. She did not say anything for a long moment, and when she finally did speak, she did not apologize, and she did not need to, because there was nothing yet to apologize for. She simply asked me, quietly, how I had known, and I told her the truth, which was that I had not known, not really, not in any way I could have proven to her 10 minutes earlier standing in that hallway. I told her about the wine glass, the cold, untouched glass with the ring of condensation, the delayed laughter, the tired eyes, the blue edge of the flame, the smell underneath the bread and the candle wax. She listened to every piece of it without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet again for a moment, watching the paramedics climb out of the ambulance with their equipment, already moving toward the wife first, then toward the others. She told me that none of what I had just described would have held up as a reason to clear a full table on a Friday night, not on its own, not to anyone standing where she had been standing 40 minutes earlier, and that she wanted me to understand that her hesitation had not been about doubting me as a person. It had been about the simple, unavoidable math of running a business, where 4 other tables were also real people with real evenings that deserved consideration, and where flame color and cold wine glasses were not, by any professional standard she had ever been trained on, grounds for what I had just done. I told her I understood, and I meant it, because standing there in the cold with the ambulance lights sweeping across both of our faces, I could see with total clarity how impossible my request must have sounded from the other side of that hallway conversation, how thin the thread had been that I was asking her to trust. The lead paramedic knelt down next to the wife first, checking her pulse, checking her eyes with a small penlight, and I watched his expression shift from routine concern into something faster, more focused, the particular focus of a professional who has just recognized a pattern he has seen before and hoped not to see again tonight. He looked up at the small crowd of us standing there, at Debbie, at me, at the host still holding the front door open behind us, and he asked, in a voice that had gone suddenly urgent in a way that made the whole sidewalk go still, whether anyone else inside that restaurant had been sitting anywhere near that same table. Debbie answered him before I could, telling him that the section had already been cleared, that no other guests had been seated within the immediate radius of that alcove, and that she had personally directed the host to move 2 nearby tables the moment she called in the gas shutoff. The paramedic nodded once, the kind of nod that was less about relief and more about triage, and he asked Debbie directly whether the gas line to that fireplace insert had actually been shut off yet or only ordered shut off, because to him those were 2 very different facts, and only one of them mattered right now. Debbie radioed the maintenance technician again, and this time I heard the technician's voice come back, clipped and fast, in a way it had not been 40 minutes earlier, confirming that the line was off, confirming that he had felt the heat coming off that vent himself the moment he finally reached it, confirming, in words that landed on me harder than I expected, that the flame regulator on that unit had been failing for what he guessed was several days, allowing an improper mixture to burn without the visible orange combustion that would have flagged the problem to anyone glancing at it casually. I want to explain, as clearly and as plainly as I can, what that actually meant, because this is the part of the story where the proof stops being a feeling in my chest and becomes something you can hold in your hand something you can measure with an instrument, something no amount of doubt or hesitation could argue against once it existed. A properly tuned gas flame burns with enough oxygen mixed in to combust almost completely, which is why it burns orange and clean, and why it does not produce meaningful amounts of carbon monoxide. When that mixture goes wrong, when the regulator fails and too little oxygen reaches the flame, the combustion becomes incomplete. An incomplete combustion is exactly what turns a flame from orange to that thin blue edge I had noticed without understanding what I was looking at. Incomplete combustion is also, and this is the part that matters most, the exact chemical process that produces carbon monoxide, an odorless, colorless gas with no smell of its own at all. The paramedic explained, once the ambulance crew had all 4 guests on portable oxygen and pulse oximeters clipped to their fingers, that carbon monoxide poisoning almost never announces itself the way people expect from movies. There is no smell, because carbon monoxide itself has none. What people sometimes catch, without ever consciously identifying it, is not the gas itself, but trace elements riding alongside it, depending on what exactly is combusting improperly. Faint, metallic, easy to miss, easy to write off as candle wax or old wiring or nothing at all. The dizziness, the fatigue nobody could explain, the headache the friend had blamed on wine, the wife needing her glass moved because her coordination had quietly been failing for the better part of an hour. All of it lined up now with a clarity that made my stomach turn over slowly, because it meant every single detail I had used to convince myself something was wrong had actually been a real physical symptom happening in front of me the entire time, and I simply had not had the vocabulary yet to call it what it was. The pulse oximeter readings came back within a few minutes, 4 separate numbers that the lead paramedic read aloud to Debbie in a low, steady voice meant to keep the growing sidewalk crowd from panicking. The wife's blood oxygen saturation, combined with her carbon monoxide reading, put her carboxyhemoglobin level at a percentage the paramedic described as moderate to serious, high enough that continuing to sit at that table for even another 20 or 30 minutes could have pushed her into a level requiring far more aggressive treatment than oxygen through a mask on a sidewalk. The husband's reading was lower, but still clearly elevated. The friend who had been drinking heavily all night had the second highest reading of the 4, which the paramedic said made sense, because alcohol and carbon monoxide compete for some of the same processes in the bloodstream, meaning his heavy drinking had likely masked how quickly the gas was actually affecting him. These were not feelings. These were not things I had sensed or intuited or guessed at. These were numbers on a small handheld monitor, verified independently by 2 separate paramedics, cross-checked against a gas line that maintenance had physically confirmed was malfunctioning, on a flame regulator that the technician later pulled from the unit entirely and set down on a metal tray for the fire marshal to photograph less than an hour later. You could hold that regulator in your hand. You could see the corrosion along its edge under a flashlight. There was nothing emotional about it, nothing lucky about it, nothing that depended on anyone believing me or not believing me anymore. The fire marshal arrived not long after the second ambulance, because Debbie, once she understood the scope of what had actually happened, made the call herself, without waiting to be told to, walking the 1.5-block radius herself to make sure nobody wandering past on the sidewalk was affected by any residual venting from the building. He spent close to 40 minutes with the maintenance technician going through the unit, and he confirmed, in a report that would later become part of the restaurant's official incident file, that the flame regulator failure had likely been developing gradually over a period of days. consistent with the technician's own suspicion, and that the ventilation for that particular alcove, given its proximity to the kitchen's own exhaust systems, had likely been drawing improperly for long enough that the carbon monoxide had been slowly concentrating in that specific pocket of the dining room rather than dispersing the way it would have anywhere else in the building. All 4 guests were treated and released later that same night, and the wife, once she was breathing clean oxygen and color, had come back into her face, the specific color that had drained out of it sometime around the point her head first went down onto her folded arms, looked up at me from the gurney they had insisted on using for her despite her protests, and asked me quietly how I had known before any of them did. I did not have a clever answer for her either. I told her the truth, which was that I had not known, not in the way that word usually means. I had noticed things that did not add up, one at a time, none of them enough on their own, and I had been too frightened of being wrong to say anything sooner than I did. Debbie stood a few feet away during that conversation, arms crossed against the cold, watching me the entire time, and when the ambulance finally pulled away with all 4 of them inside, lights no longer flashing, sirens no longer needed, she turned to me on that empty sidewalk and said the first fully unguarded thing I had heard her say all night, which was that in 20 years of running restaurant floors, she had never once had a new server override a direct order, and she had never once been glad about it until tonight. We stood there on that sidewalk for a while after the ambulance pulled away, neither of us saying much, the cold starting to settle into my hands now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go. Debbie was the one who eventually said we should get back inside, because the dining room, unbelievably, was still half full of guests who had no real idea what had just happened outside those front doors, and a restaurant does not stop needing to be run just because something enormous has happened in front of it. Walking back through the front doors of Thistlewood felt strange in a way I did not expect. The warmth hit me first, the specific warmth of a dining room in winter, and underneath it, for just a moment, I caught myself instinctively checking the air near that alcove out of habit, before remembering that the gas line was off now, that whatever had been sitting invisibly in that pocket of air for however many days was no longer there to notice. The host had done exactly what Debbie asked, moving the 2 nearest tables without alarming anyone, offering a round of drinks on the house with a vague explanation about a maintenance issue near the back wall, the kind of smooth, practiced cover story that keeps a dining room calm without lying about anything that actually mattered. Most guests never learned the full story that night. A few asked questions. Nobody pressed hard, because nothing about the room looked like an emergency by the time they walked back in. And that, I think, is its own kind of quiet miracle, that an entire crisis can happen and resolve itself close enough to a room full of strangers that most of them go home still thinking about their entrees. Debbie pulled the alcove off the floor plan entirely for the rest of that night, taping a small, handwritten sign to the half wall that said the section was closed for maintenance, and she asked one of the line cooks to prop the kitchen door open near that wall to keep air moving through the space until the fire marshal cleared it completely, which he did a little after midnight, long after most of the dining room had emptied out and gone home. I finished my shift that night. Technically, though finished is a strange word for what the last 2 hours actually looked like. I refilled waters. I cleared plates. I smiled at tables who had no idea that 90 minutes earlier I had been standing on the sidewalk outside, watching 4 strangers breathe oxygen through plastic masks. My hands did not fully stop shaking until sometime around 11, and even then it was not a dramatic stopping, just a slow fading, the way cold fades out of your fingers once you have been back inside long enough to forget you were ever out in it. Debbie found me near the end of the night, back near the server station, where I had first started putting the pieces together hours earlier, and she did not make a speech. She was not the kind of person who made speeches, and I think if she had tried, it would have felt wrong for both of us. She told me that the write-up she had threatened me with in that hallway was not happening, obviously, and she said it with something close to a small, tired laugh, the first laugh I had heard out of her all night. Then she told me something I have thought about more than almost anything else from that entire evening, which was that she had been doing this job for 20 years, specifically because she was good at reading rooms, good at reading people, good at knowing when something was actually wrong versus when it only looked that way, and that watching me be right about something she had no way of verifying had rattled her less than she expected it to, because the version of herself from earlier in her career, the 25-year-old version running her first floor, would not have let me get anywhere near that table at all. I did not know what to say to that, so I did not say much of anything, and she did not seem to need me to. She told me to go home, that she would handle the incident report, and that she would need a statement from me sometime in the next few days, once the fire marshal's paperwork made its way through the proper channels, purely procedural, nothing to worry about. The Regulator itself ended up mattering more to this story than almost anything I actually said that night. The fire marshal photographed it in place before removing it, then bagged it and tagged it as evidence for the restaurant's insurance claim and the gas company's own internal investigation into how a unit installed and serviced by a licensed technician had been allowed to degrade to that point without tripping any of the safety mechanisms it was supposed to have. Weeks later, once the paperwork worked its way back to Debbie, she showed me a printed photo from that report, the corroded edge of the Regulator visible even in the flat, unglamorous lighting of an evidence photograph, a small ring of blackened metal, no bigger than a bottle cap, that had, for reasons no one could fully explain, been slowly failing for what the report estimated was somewhere between 4 and 6 days. 4 to 6 days meant that whatever I had noticed that night had not appeared out of nowhere. It meant that servers before me, guests before that table, possibly even I myself on an earlier shift, had walked past that alcove while the flame was already changing, already burning wrong, and none of us had caught it, because none of us had happened to be standing at the right angle, at the right moment, paying attention to the right, small, ordinary detail. That fact sat with me longer than almost anything else from that night. It was not luck that I caught it when I did. It was also not some special instinct I was born with. It was 6 or 7 small things, individually meaningless, that happened to line up in front of one particular server on one particular Friday night. And the only difference between me and anyone else who might have walked past that same alcove earlier in the week was that I happened to still be looking when it mattered. Thistlewood reopened the alcove about 2 weeks later, after a full unit replacement and 3 separate inspections, and Debbie made a point of seating regulars there first, the kind of guests who had been coming for years and would notice if the restaurant seemed nervous about its own dining room. The new fireplace insert burned a flame that was, if I am being honest, almost identical to the old one, clean and orange and entirely unremarkable, exactly the way a fireplace insert is supposed to look when nothing is wrong with it at all. I still work at Thistlewood. Debbie still runs the floor, and if anything, she has gotten slightly more particular about small details since that night. Not paranoid, just attentive in a way she was not quite as attentive before, and I do not think that is a coincidence. We have never really talked about that night again in any big, meaningful way. It comes up occasionally, Usually when a new hire starts and someone on staff tells them the story of the new waitress and table 9 as a kind of unofficial orientation, half warning and half compliment, depending on how you choose to hear it. I think about that regulator sometimes, sitting bagged and tagged in some filing cabinet at an insurance office, a small corroded ring of metal that never once cared whether anyone believed me because it was simply true, sitting there in the dark of that alcove being true, whether I noticed it or not, whether Debbie believed me or not, whether any of us were paying attention or not. It did not need permission to be real. It just was, quietly, the whole time, waiting for someone to finally